Hi, Bradley. It's great to be back again with you for this fourth edition of Where is Jho Low? This is our attempts to try to find the world's biggest fugitive criminal, white-collar criminal. In the past, we've looked at try to find photos of where he is. We've talked with Syed Sadiq, the former minister, about what Malaysia can do to put more pressure on him. And today, we're going to take a different tack. We actually put out a poll on Twitter to ask our followers what they wanted us to talk about, and we gave them a choice. And the winner by far was how much money did Jho Low really steal? Because often we talk about this number, 4.5 billion. That was the number that the Department of Justice in America has used for this fraud, and that was already one of the biggest frauds in history, white-collar frauds in history. Whereas in fact, recently, there have been documents citing this number of 8 billion, a lot larger, almost double. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how they got to that number and why it's important. But let's just start with a little video that Bradley's produced, where he talks about, very quickly, not too boringly, about how we got to that number, where it comes from.
So what this liquidator firm is saying, Quantuma, is we know about all this money that's been straightforwardly stolen. It's written about in all the DOJ filings, things like the Good Star phase, 1 billion, Albar BVI phase, 1.3 billion. None of this stuff is surprising, although typically the SRC part hasn't been added to many of the DOJ filings. So what Quantuma is saying is $4.6 billion is completely stolen money. We know that. But what they're additionally saying is all the other money that 1MDB invested is potentially diverted funds as well, because not all of it has been tracked down, fully understood, fully realized, and that's why they have this bigger number of actually 7.6 billion, and they're adding to that the dispute with Abu Dhabi, which adds it to another 8.5 billion. So that's the kind of target money that they're trying to recover. So in a sense, 4.6 billion is the minimum amount stolen. 8.5 is where they're kind of trying to head as a liquidator firm. And there's a lot of other funds in the 1MDB transaction history that could also be stolen. It could add up to a lot more. So that's why they've come up with that number.
So there's Bradley explaining how and why people are now talking about 8 billion lost in this fraud. Bradley, why is it important that well, obviously it's a lot bigger number that's been stolen, but also it's important because such a small amount of that money has been recovered. And why don't you tell us what's been recovered? And also, if only that amount's been recovered, Jho Low's left with a lot of money, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think what people don't realize is that if you add up all the assets that have been recovered, it only comes to a fraction of the total amount that was diverted. And so that basically means that Jho Low and people in his network and other co-conspirators still have many billions of dollars that were taken essentially from the Malaysian public, stolen from the debt of Malaysia. So Malaysia is actually paying interest on that stolen money, and it's actually, I think that's what makes this case the most outrageous case in the world and at the moment, because it's we've talked about Jho Low being in China and the various strategic relationships he's built there, but add to that, he's also still sitting on top of a mountain of gold, essentially.
So how much has been recovered?
1.4 billion is recovered by the US and the UK together. So that's like all these luxury homes, planes, company stakes, everything from a mansion in Los Angeles to a stake in EMI Music, right? So, and then there was some real estate in London as well. And then other money out there, there's money that's being sought that's related to Tariq Obaid in Switzerland. There's other little pools of cash. So it's not all in Jho Low's pockets, but essentially what I'm really excited about in this liquidator case is that we're going to see the gap filled between all those assets and then what he did with all the other liquid cash from that point. How did he get money from these offshore centers into China and things like that? And what else did he buy? There might be other assets in the world.
Right. We should be clear to say that we don't believe that Jho Low is in control of the difference between 8 billion and 1.4 billion. Probably not that amount of money, but this higher number of 8 billion, yeah, exactly. This higher number of 8 billion makes us believe that he does still control billions of dollars. Now that is important for two reasons. One, It explains why he's able to remain free. I mean, we've also explained that he has the dirt on China and on Chinese corrupt Belt and Road infrastructure deals. That's one reason that China doesn't want to see him back in Malaysia or in the US facing trial. But the other one is he's just got a lot of money to still pay people off. If he's got billions of dollars, that's very, very unusual for somebody on the run. And it's another reason why Malaysian people and Malaysia's government should be extremely, extremely angry at the fact that nothing has happened in this case. Because, so let's talk about what Malaysia's been able to recover. They say that they've been able to recover 4.5 billion. Now that's not the money that Bradley talked about, the 1 point something billion that came back from the assets that were sold, the mansions and the Wolf of Wall Street film and all those proceeds that came back to Malaysia. But Malaysia also got money from Goldman Sachs, which paid a huge fine, a record fine under US anti-bribery laws. So that I think that was more than $1 billion. And so that 4.5 billion certainly hasn't come back from Jho Low. So, I think there's a tendency to look at that 4.5 billion and the old number of 4.5 billion stolen and to say, well, they've got it all back, but they haven't. And that's why Jho Low is left with billions of dollars, right, Bradley?
Yeah, and also this explains why Jho Low has been able to be still doing so much stuff since he went on the run, right? If he was on the run and he lost his control of his money, we wouldn't have heard much from Jho Low. In fact, he might have been arrested. But in fact, he had so much money squirreled away somewhere in the world, in China, wherever, that he was being able to make these offers to people and send tens of millions of dollars across the world, right? So he sent all that money over to Praz that was going to be used for his various attempts to convince Trump to drop the case. So he's been paying these law firms probably in the plus $20 million a year range. And by the way, he's not in any legal proceedings. That's all just like strategy. And so it's really an amazing expenditure on legal expenses and just maintaining his family, and this entourage, making sure everyone's kept sweet because he doesn't want people to flip on him. That's why we have all these guys still around him, Casey Tang, Fat Eric, people like that. So I think it explains a lot. I think a lot of people are struggling to understand, how is this guy on the run? How is he able to stay on the run? Why is China letting him stay there? I think the money is a big component of that.
Yeah,
and it's really important to understand.
And we can't stress.
In fact, if Malaysia were able to recover all that money, plus the Goldman Sachs, they would actually have a profit, right? They would have a profit of whatever the Goldman Sachs payment was.
Yeah, and we can't stress enough that one of the reasons that the Malaysian government doesn't want him back is because there are clearly people still involved in the government in Malaysia who just don't want him to come back and talk about what went on, because some of those people may have been involved. And if you look at it from a purely financial standpoint, it is extremely important for Malaysia that this money comes back. And I think it's just because it's not properly understood how much money is at stake here that is the reason it's not a bigger issue in Malaysia. And it really should be. It's not for us to say we're foreigners, we're not Malaysians, but we're just astounded by the fact that Jho Low is able to just remain free. Right, let's move on, Bradley. We've got some other things going on, haven't we? We continually are receiving tips on our Where is Jho Low hashtag Where is Jho Low and to our projectbrazen at protonmail.com email address, and we received a photo. Why don't you? Well, first of all, let's stick this photo up and have a quick look at it.
So this photo came from a private investigator who had been working on this case. Obviously, there was different times when Jho Low was being, really sought after because of in large part because of this idea of recovering money. It's unclear who hired this private investigator, but it could have been the Malaysian government. It could have been some intermediary of the Malaysian government. But anyways, he was tracked down. And this goes to the heart of what we talked about before. A lot of what Jho Low's life has become is wandering around shopping malls. And it's kind of, the banality of this greed at the center of it is just going around shopping malls. So now this private investigator showed me other photos that they wouldn't let us use that actually had the front-facing, a frontal picture of Jho Low, but they only let us use this one for some reason or another. And you basically see the back of Jho Low with one of his assistants directly to the right of him, and then you can see the back of Jesselyn. And then, now what's interesting about this picture and was identified to me is there's a Chinese man in the picture as well who is believed to be one of Jho Low's handlers. So we actually reported this in one of our articles back in 2019. But he has these two people with him all the time, and they're believed to be Chinese intelligence operatives who basically are just in charge of staying with Jho all the time and follow him around, and they take extra security precautions. They kind of manage some security protocol as well. So even though he's wandering around a shopping mall back in this era in particular, he still had people with him that could, at a moment's notice, pick up the phone, make a call, kind of change the situation. And it's pretty clear to me, but this is really a hypothesis, that these people were working for Sun Li Jun, who was the kind of domestic spy chief that was one of Jho Low's key people, and who is now in prison in China on corruption charges. So it begs the question about who's protecting Jho or who's looking after Jho now.
All right. So, Bradley, one other thing we wanted to touch on today is, given that it's so astounding how little the Malaysian government is doing, there's 8 billion missing and so little is happening. Syed Sadiq, who we interviewed last week, is planning a peaceful protest at the Chinese embassy and a petition. So I think he's still doing that. One thing we've decided to do here is we've put together an information poster in Chinese with Jho Low's, some of Jho Low imagery on it, because we think that's a way that we could try to get that out digitally into the Chinese speaking world and see what comes up. So why don't you explain what we've done there?
Yeah, I mean, basically, our theory is that Chinese people will sympathize with Malaysian people about the idea that one of the most infamous fugitives from their country is living in China. And so we're asking for help to understand more about why it is Joe's in China, where he is. And again, the final goal of this project isn't to facilitate some citizen's arrest, but it's more to just explain how this can be. How is it possible that a fugitive who still has billions of dollars can live in a neighboring country and live freely? It seems kind of ludicrous and crazy for most people to understand. And so I think in some ways the journey to find Jho Low is even more important than actually finding him, his exact location on any given day.
We should be very clear to say we're not trying to do a citizen's arrest, as Bradley said. And a lot of people have come out and said, why you guys are tilting at windmills, what are you trying to do? You're never going to be able to find him. But that's not the point. The point here is, as we've said, a lot of money is stolen, is still missing. And these tactics that we're using are ways to try to shine light. There's this phrase in journalism, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And it means, just the more information you can get and the more open you can be about it, the better chances you are of reaching the end goal. It's not going to be easy, but we hope that these posters will lead to some other fresh leads. We're continuing to get information. And so, whatever we find out, that'll be the content of our next episode. So for now, keep the tips coming, and we'll see you in a week's time.